On June 21st, 1990, Nelson and Winnie Mandela marched in triumph into Harlem's Riverside Church to the sound of African drums, following the master drummer Babatunde Olatunji. Mandela's face beamed with pride when a contingent of South Africans broke out in the Toi Toi, the protest dance of Free South Africa. A triumphant and prideful Harlem was celebrating one of its most honored sacred heroes, a moral champion who defied the world's most racist regime, apartheid. To us, he had come home.
During the long years when we were in prison, you did not forget us. Neither did you abandon our struggling people. You took up the mission of promoting justice and peace. We salute you. In the words of the prophet Isaiah, we have risen up as on the wings of eagles. We have run and not grown weary. We have walked and not fainted. And finally, our destination is in sight.
Welcome to the African Studies Association's 64th annual meeting. We've struggled through yet another period of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we're beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. The vaccines, despite some resistance to their use, are proving effective in stopping the spread in those areas where people get them. But our continent, Africa, is suffering from the greatest shortages, and there's much work to be done to stem a demographic crisis. We're all hoping that this is our last virtual conference and that we'll be together in Philadelphia next year. This organization, the African Studies Association, has been a leader in promoting the study of Africa in the United States for over 60 years. It has been an important support for my development as a historian of Africa, As I rotate off as president of the association, I thank all of you for entrusting me to lead the organization. I pass the baton to Sena Aladu, a wonderful colleague from Rutgers, who assumes the next presidency. I want to begin my address with a quote from Amilcar Cabral in a talk I attended on October 20th, 1972 at the Black Economic Research Center, a Harlem think tank, and also the location of SWAPO's office. He, Cabral, asked that the African Information Service invite leaders of African American organizations to meet with him for a small private discussion. The conversation, Connecting the Struggles, an informal talk with Black Americans, is published in Return to the Source, Selected Speeches of Amilcar Cabral. I still remember the atmosphere in the room as Cabral carefully explained his theories of national liberation, his analysis of the contradictions that PAIGC faced in their struggle in Guinea-Bissau, and the encouraging message that he brought about our struggle for Black liberation. Cabral was speaking about the connections between the African American and African struggles when he told us, all the achievements toward the solution of your problems here are real contributions to our own struggle. And we are very encouraged in our struggle by the fact that each day more of the African people born in America become conscious of their responsibilities to the struggle in Africa. We think that all you can do here to develop your own conditions in the sense of progress, in the sense of history, and in the sense of the total realization of your aspirations as human beings is a contribution for us. It is also a contribution for you to never forget that you are Africans. Tragically, 3 months later, Cabral was assassinated in Guinea-Conakry. My talk today is a personal reflection on the period in the late 60s through 90s when African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and continental Africans in Harlem acted collectively against colonialism and imperialism on the one hand, and discrimination and racism on the other. The project begins in the 1960s, a decade of global political activism, the independence of Africa, the French student movement, the Tet Offensive, the Black Power movement, and the Black Panthers. People in many parts of the world rose up to protest unjust conditions and to preserve their right to object to abuses of power. This talk is the initial stage of an oral history project and personal memoir, documenting a period of collaboration between radical African nationalists and militant Harlem residents who joined in the Black liberation struggle at the end of the 20th century. This was when we, quote, practiced diaspora, unquote, in especially meaningful ways. Together, we organized and attended demonstrations, sponsored educational programs, created radical study groups, and hosted political celebrities from throughout the world. There was an international energy that revived the mythical standing of Harlem as a core center of radical Black liberation politics. We shared experiences about the meanings of Black struggle, became informed about the nuances of political cultures in each region, and created a radical form of Pan-Africanism. This talk happens at an auspicious time for me. I came to New York in 1966 to get a master's at Columbia's School of International Affairs. On campus, I had an encounter with a Black student that was an omen of the shifting political landscape of the Black movement. He asked, "Sister, I hear you believe in integration," unquote. I was completely flummoxed. Weren't we all struggling for this? I asked myself. This, it turns out, was my introduction to Black power. I moved to Harlem in 1967 and have been here ever since, living on my current block for over 50 years. When I look back at these years, I realize what an exceptional period this was for me, an African-American woman studying Africa. My life intersected with many major events that involved Africa, African political exiles, and militant movements in North America, the Caribbean, Latin America, and here in the US. In the case of Canada, these included the 1968 Montreal Black Writers Conference, that CLR James, Robert Hill, Stokely Carmichael, etc. attended, as well as Walter Rodney. As it was significant as well because this is the time when they expelled Walter Rodney from Jamaica on his return. The Black Canadian demonstration at the joint meeting of ASA and the Canadian African Studies Association was against white control of knowledge about Africa. And the West Indian students' occupation of Sir George Williams University, which just was important in that it launched the Black Power movement in the Caribbean, and they destroyed the computer center. I was born in Hampton, Virginia, to parents who were graduates of HBCUs, Hampton Institute, and North Carolina College for Negroes. My maternal grandmother, whose father came from British Guyana soon after Reconstruction, graduated from Hampton Institute in 1898 and became a school teacher. My father's family was from Ahoskie, North Carolina, and includes several political activists who I recently found were relatives. Jarvis Tyner of the Communist Party and his brother McCoy Tyner, the pianist. Bree Newsom, who took down the Confederate flag on South Carolina State House grounds after the Charleston shooting, and her father, the Reverend Clarence Newsom, former president of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. My own father, Henry Mitchell, was also a minister, in his case of the Episcopal Church. Little did I know that I would become an academic specializing in African social and labor history. This I owe to Walter Rodney, who suggested my dissertation project on Nigerian coal miners. Africa also intersected negatively with my training at Columbia. The Dean of International Affairs was Dean Andrew Cordier, who was Undersecretary of Dag Hammarskjöld at the UN. He facilitated the coup against Congo Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba. He denied Lumumba's forces access to airports and radio stations at a critical time. Cordier was, in essence, very responsible for Lumumba's death. This was also the time of two major assassinations of Black leaders. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. A note reflective of the current fate of Harlem: the only church which agreed to hold his funeral, Child's Memorial Temple Church on the corner of my street and Amsterdam Avenue, was destroyed last year to build a homeless shelter. King was then assassinated on April 4th, 1968. In deep grief, I wanted to be with neighbors, and I ran to 125th Street to mourn in the midst of the riot. Several weeks later, I became involved in the Columbia strike from April 23rd to 30th of 1968. Black students joined whites in opposing Columbia's research for the Vietnam War and a plan to locate a segregated gym in Harlem's beautiful Morningside Park. This turned out to be a pivotal experience that brought me in touch with dozens of African political exiles who came to New York. Internationally, most of the third world colonies of Europe launched movements for independence and then tried to navigate the Cold War by affiliating with the non-aligned movement. This would, they hoped, allow them to secure some control over their own futures. In most of Africa, the first wave of independence was secured through negotiation. But in the colonies of Portugal and the Southern African region, white governments refused to bring any reforms that could lead to majority rule. This was a time of radical political shifts, both internationally and locally. These movements established armed wings of their political parties, making the 60s a period of African liberation movements. In the US, there was also a reevaluation of violence as a strategy in the African-American struggle and the presence of whites in the Black liberation movement. SNCC's young leadership promoted Black power, a philosophy of overcoming psychological barriers that block self-determination. This resonated with South Africa and Steve Biko's Black consciousness movement that fueled the Soweto uprising in 1976. In the Caribbean, Black power shaped a new left movement that had a deep critique of post-colonial Caribbean society. The Workers' Party Jamaica, Grenada's New Jewel movement, the Trinidad Black Power movement, all represented this new tendency. Additionally, Black students in Canada, influenced by the Montreal Writers' Conference, demonstrated at George Williams University, protesting discrimination and racism. With King and Malcolm assassinated, the nonviolence of the civil rights movement appeared weakened. This was challenged, and it was also challenged by a new younger breed of activists. In Harlem, the African liberation movement and the radical struggle for US rights fed off of each other through organizational contact and collaboration, but also in the more casual occasions where politics happens. Throughout Harlem, the exile community was very international. This was reflected in social events where Africans, Latin Americans, Asians, and African Americans met, danced, drank, and made politics. Social contact created informal networks and friendships that sustained a deep Black internationalism based on a shared suffering caused by repression. Black power led many to explore radical theories in politics. Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth was a critical text for study groups hungry for knowledge about revolutions and social justice. Other writers, Che Guevara, Karl Marx, Walter Rodney, Mao Zedong, were all important for these groups. In Harlem, African militants were exposed to many radical political groups in Central and Latin America. Cuba played an important role in forging these coalitions and often held pan-Caribbean meetings that encouraged strategic collaboration and analysis. In New York, Casa Las Americas, a pro-revolutionary Cuba group, often held fundraisers for many of these organizations. The Sandinistas of Nicaragua, the FMLN in El Salvador, and others were in touch with the Anglo-Caribbean through Cuba. Similarly, the movements in Latin America's Southern Cone, Pinochet's Chile, and the military's Argentina had members in New York who were also interested in Africa's events. Spanish Harlem, the eastern flank of Central Harlem, was a location of various Latino movements that included the Young Lords and an earlier generation of Puerto Rican nationalists. In West Harlem, there was a large and rapidly growing population of Dominicans who came to the US after the military coup to remove their first democratically elected president, Juan Bosch. The presence of African exiles encouraged locals to explore forbidden Marxist-Leninist ideas and to join in solidarity with the struggles in Asia and Latin America. There was an endless thirst to find lessons that could enrich the African liberation movement. Study groups multiplied within communities and especially around educational institutions. I joined a group of West Indian graduate students to read volume 1 and 2 of Capital over a period of 2 years. Students in Harlem's 2 major universities, Columbia and New York City's City College, were similarly interested in liberation movements. In fact, many of the movements had operatives enrolled in New York schools. There were many interesting implications. Black students in the Columbia strike, for example, used negotiation tactics reminiscent of the Vietnamese in their meetings with the university administrators. All this had come from the readings of their courses. While the first wave of African independence was relatively nonviolent, the second wave was more protracted and violent. In the 60s, armed branches sent politically radical operatives abroad to organize support. For Southern Africa, the trigger event was the Sharpeville Massacre in 1960, which led to the banning of the ANC, PAC, and SWAPO, and in 1976, the Soweto uprising. Ultimately, the last vestiges of white minority rule dissolved under international support that these national liberation movements generated through powerful networks of sympathizers. Solidarity groups supported sanctions, divestment, and armed struggle. When these liberation movements were authenticated by the UN, this opened doors of support, financial and otherwise, for placing their members outside of their country. Fidel Castro became a powerful example of a courageous anti-imperialist daring to challenge his powerful neighbor. Harlem's enthusiastic response to his visit in 1960 will be discussed below. Portugal's war against its colonies lasted for more than a decade, and exiles from PAIGC of Guinea-Bissau, MPLA Angola, and Frelimo Mozambique brought a new linguistic diversity to the activist community in Harlem. In Harlem, the Portuguese anti-colonial struggle benefited from the tireless efforts of Robert Van Leer, a civil rights lawyer who represented Black students in the Columbia strike. He closed his practice to found the Mozambique Film Project and made the film A Luta Continua on the Liberation War, and afterwards on the film O Povo Organizado on Mozambique's social revolution. When political exiles arrived in Harlem, they found a community with decades of political experience mobilizing around issues of African decolonization and racial discrimination. It was during World War I that Harlem became Black, multi-class, and a multinational community. There were African Americans fleeing the lynchings and the Klan in the South, Caribbean people, workers, and professionals escaping the sugar plantations, and Black Latinos from Cuba and Puerto Rico seeking a better life. The contours of a distinct political culture were visible early in cross-class coalitions of skilled and unskilled workers, artists, professionals, and educators. All had joined in a number of campaigns of international and local significance. One of the most dramatic domestic mobilizations represented in an iconic photograph was the 10,000 person silent march to protest the 1917 East St. Louis massacre, where several hundred African Americans were killed. Harlem was also famous for street corner philosophers on stepladders who engaged in political debates and who discussed racial issues with crowds on Speaker's Corner on Lenox and 135th Street, the current site of the Schomburg Library. In this way, even illiterates could engage in sharing political views. In the 20s and 30s, artists, musicians, and politicians made Harlem a vibrant cultural political space whose nature and character was defined by the social, intellectual, and artistic energy of the Harlem Renaissance. Socialism held a special appeal at that time for West Indian and African American activists who came to Harlem just before the war. The Black press, Amsterdam News, the Chicago Defender, and the Baltimore Sun were important sources of political information discussed in beauty parlors and barbershops of Harlem. There were early socialist organizations like the African Brotherhood for African Liberation and Redemption, a radical Black organization founded in 1919 by West Indian socialists Cyril Briggs and Richard B. Moore. The largest organization was Marcus Garvey's movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which mobilized thousands to protest colonialism, to assert the value of African civilization, and the importance of economic self-reliance. Garvey and the intellectuals, politicians, and cultural workers of the Harlem Renaissance transformed Harlem into a center for cultural and political energy that fostered a radical Pan-Africanism. The Council of African Affairs, a socialist group founded in 1937 by Paul Robeson, W.B. Du Bois, and Altius Hunton Jr., continued to function into the 1950s, mobilizing for the liberation of African countries. The council benefited from an alliance and eventual merger with the Communist Party, who joined them in launching educational initiatives targeting Harlem on the exploitative nature of colonialism. Black internationalism flourished in the 1930s. The NACP, the Communist Party, and the Garvey movement were not necessarily distinct. Members overlapped organizational boundaries, even as there were sharp contradictions between leaders. Thousands joined the 1935 campaign against Italy's invasion and occupation of Ethiopia. Harlem's opposition was massive and visceral. Ethiopia was the beloved kingdom. It was mentioned in the Bible, and it had an emperor, Haile Selassie. And it was the only African state that had effectively defeated conquest by Europe, in this case, Italy. The Black newspapers carried weekly bulletins from the war front that emphasized that the Italians were committing war crimes by using mustard gas. Harlem residents boycotted and destroyed Italian stores located in East Harlem. Others led fundraising drives, and men volunteered to go and fight. When World War II was over, Harlem residents continued to support Paul Robeson and other members of the former Council of African Affairs, despite the US government's anti-communism. Harlem even elected a communist, Benjamin S. Davis, a Harvard-educated lawyer, twice to the city council. Davis was arrested and jailed for violating the Smith Act, but never renounced his beliefs. They also continued to support Paul Robeson and other members of the Council of African Affairs, despite attacks during the McCarthy hearings and government's staunch anti-communism. Thus, for Harlem, the late 20th century activism was but a continuation of a long sustained support of African exiles and of Black liberation. In 1975, a somewhat confused Harlem greeted an early group of Ethiopians fleeing the Ethiopian Civil War that abolished the monarchy of Haile Selassie and established the Derg. Many Ethiopians came to the US and joined other exile groups from the various African liberation movements. In the 1960s, the list of visitors reads like a who's who in radical movements throughout the world. On December 13, 1964, Malcolm X brought Abdurrahman Mohammed Babu, leader of the Zanzibari Revolution, to speak in the Audubon Ballroom. This was the same hall where Malcolm would be assassinated 2 months later. For the thousands of political exiles, Harlem was a community of sympathetic supporters for those fleeing tightening repression. It became a home away from home, a respite from the racial antagonisms of Europe or of Southern Africa. This community not only understood the debilitating impact of colonialism and racism, but was receptive to the messages that these exiles and liberation movements conveyed. In essence, it was a political community prepared to assist with the struggle in any way possible, and they did. The popularity of Black power also encouraged a cultural movement that reflected the strong identification that residents here and elsewhere felt with Africa. Culturally, the Black is Beautiful movement hit Harlem like a storm. People embraced Africa, wore Afro hairstyles, African clothes, gave their children and selves African names, invented African holidays like Kwanzaa, studied Swahili, etc. The entrepreneurial Barbadian Braithwaite brothers, Elombe and Kwame, promoted the movement. Kwame formed the Grandessa Models, a modeling agency established to challenge the dominance of white beauty standards in the modeling industry. They held college and community tours with models who, as Chimamanda Adichie said, whose skin was the color of chocolate. Models also introduced natural hairstyles and wore African print clothes. The Braithwaite brothers held Miss Natural Standard of Beauty contests on Marcus Garvey Day, which was August 17th. They also brought Africans from the UN to African ambassadors' dinners that allowed Harlem residents to have direct contact with representatives of independent African states. Brother Elombe was a journalist and a tireless activist who organized protests against apartheid, invited South Africans to talk with the community, and promoted the liberation struggle. He was a co-producer with Gil Noble of a popular Black public interest program, Like It Is, which ran from 1968 to 2011. It focused on Pan-Africanist coverage. In 1975, Elombe founded the Patrice Lumumba Coalition to support Angola's struggle against Portugal and expanded the focus to include the Southern African struggle as well. They were particularly active after the Soweto uprising and often offered a venue to African activists and exiles. When liberation movements decided to adopt armed struggle, it gave more prestige to the strategy of violence. The Soviet Union and Cuba became important sources for training and weapons for those armed wings. The Cuban Revolution changed the landscape of possibilities for those struggling for self-determination. Fidel Castro became a heroic figure in the national liberation struggles. In the US, the Black movement became more receptive to violence as a strategy of self-defense. In South Africa, the Nationalist Party government banned the ANC and the PNC in 1960 after the Sharpeville massacre. Mandela and others co-founded its armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation. Its rival, the Pan-African Congress, established the Azanian People's Liberation Army. Similarly, the liberation movements in the Portuguese colonies launched their armed struggles. The subsequent repression of militants in the Portuguese colonies and Rhodesia brought a population with direct political experience into Harlem politics. Angola's liberation movement was complicated by several groups, MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA. This threw their struggle into a proxy civil war in which Cuba and the US, South Africa supported different sides. These divisions were also reflected in Harlem, with some feeling that UNITA was the, quote, blackest, unquote, of the movements, and others allied with Cuba and MPLA. Many of the exiles were admitted to local colleges and universities during a time of radical student activism. Students were agitating for Black studies programs, for schools' divestment, against the war in Vietnam, and universities' role in military research. In this context, the sharing of strategy and other information was facilitated. There was one instance that was of critical importance to me. In a serendipitous coincidence of fate, several Black student leaders of the 1968 Columbia strike were hired to teach in City University's Queens College SEEK program. SEEK was a bridge program that upgraded skills of unprepared students to go into college. The problem was that virtually all of the courses they could take were without credit, prolonging their full entry into college. An extraordinarily large number of African activists were, of which many were political operatives, were hired at Queens. The SEEK administration had allowed the Columbia students to assist with recruiting instructors and graduate assistants. A coalition of these new faculty, both the exiles and US faculty, joined dissenting Black and Latino students to protest these bureaucratic barriers that slowed their rate of graduation. It was only when I started compiling a list of those who taught at Queens or who lived in Harlem that I realized that this was an extraordinary group of political operatives that became an astonishing group of current continental leaders. They were from all over the continent. Enrolled at the new school was Age Geingob of Namibia, and Alim Habtu, a founder of the Ethiopian Student Union. They were both teaching assistants, as was Desalegn Bramato, a leading sociologist in Ethiopia of land reform. Attending Columbia was Nigerian Ambassador Ibrahim Gambari, who taught Yoruba at SEEK while a graduate student. Karapetsi Kosasili and Mongane Wali Sirote both graduated from Columbia and became poet laureates of South Africa. Bra Willie was very active in Harlem's Black arts movement with Larry Neal, Amiri Baraka, and Sam Anderson. Barbara Masekela taught at Staten Island Community College, and from 1973 to 82, she taught English literature at Rutgers University. After election, she became the ambassador of South Africa to the United States. David Sebeko, the PAC representative at the UN, was a frequent visitor and speaker in Harlem rallies. In 1979, he was unfortunately assassinated in Dar es Salaam. The Honorable Bethwell Sitai has a PhD in economics from New York University. He was one of the 12 disciples of Nelson Mandela that are the center of the film. He was both at Queens and Columbia. He became a prominent political leader, holding many positions in government in South Africa. Unbeknownst to us, he was a New York based leader of the ANC underground. In the arts, there was Hugh Masekela and Abdullah Ibrahim, the pianist. The story of the artist Emile Feni is an example of the tragic toll exile takes. From 1968 to 91, he lived in London, Los Angeles, and New York, occasionally holding appointments at universities. In 1991, he was preparing to finally return home. He collapsed and died of a heart attack in a music store. His work was extraordinarily powerful in capturing the pain and the suffering of apartheid. His African Guernica, which he completed prior to exile, is an astonishing example of his work. In addition to the African activists that came to Harlem, There were a number of Caribbean militants. Walter Rodney, who frequently came to New York and attended many programs in Harlem. Prime Minister Maurice Bishop of Grenada gave several talks to Harlem communities, as did Michael Manley and Fidel Castro. Castro's trip to Harlem has reached the status of legend. Neighbors still talk about the 10 days, October 19th to 29th in 1960, when Fidel stayed at the legendary Hotel Teresa. He was allegedly invited uptown by Malcolm X, who criticized the undiplomatic way that Castro was being treated at a midtown hotel. The move gave Harlem an opportunity to demonstrate its political independence and willingness to expose the failure of US policy on civil rights. Castro handled the visit like a theater production on race and international politics on a Harlem stage. And Harlemites skillfully played their part, demonstrating that Castro was a hero in the anti-imperialist struggle. Hundreds greeted him in the streets. Castro held court at the Teresa, hosting dinners that brought many leaders uptown from the UN for the excellent cuisine of the African-American chef. Khrushchev, Nasser, and Nehru all visited him at the hotel. When Nasser came, 2,000 Black Muslims stood at attention to greet him. Castro returned to Harlem in 1995, holding an important speech at Harlem's Abyssinian Church. Scholars of African nationalism are asking interesting new questions about the context in which political ideas are invented, debated, polished off, and then used for action. Where were the likely spaces in which Black internationalists and diasporic activists could interact? We cannot fully answer these questions until we have collected more interviews from people who live this history. However, we do know that two places were bookstores that are critical communication points. From 1932 to 1974, Louis Michaud ran the African National Memorial Bookstore, one of those unofficial sites where politics was learned and practiced. The store was a meeting place where ordinary people could get titles of relevance to Africa and the diaspora. It became one of the first casualties to the new New York State office building, the vanguard of gentrification. A second bookstore was Una Malzac's Liberation Bookstore, which was an information center for the Progressive Labor Party. Una was the daughter of Admiral Hugh Malzac, a captain of one of Marcus Garvey's ill-fated ships. The store was one of a series of political bookstores that were established by leftist organizations to stimulate political activism and knowledge about Black history writ large. Other spaces of leisure provide opportunities for political discussion. These were often the types of secretive places where oppressed people talk politics. In Harlem, as in other Black communities, bars, bookstores, and street corners featured prominently. In his eloquent study of Black London, Mark Matera describes a social geography of the districts of London, especially Camden Town, where Nigerians, Kenyans, Trinidadians, and Jamaicans met, debated, and tested ideologies and strategies that informed their anti-colonial militancy. Hopefully, my project will introduce a similar narrative of Harlem during this important and unusual period. This is a brief outline of several key elements in their interactions of African exiles with US-based Black populations in just one area of New York. During the period, this was to cover the period of decolonization. So what then was the impact of this historic period of political collaboration on Harlem and also on its militant visitors? While the definitive answer must await the execution of the project, which includes surveys of both the militant exiles and local leaders, we can offer some tentative observations. We do know from the experience of earlier generations of nationalists, especially Nkrumah and Nnamdi Azikiwe, that the sojourn in the US proved crucial for their understanding of the complexity of race relations involving African descendants and majority white states. Both leaders had experience of racial humiliation that left scars on their memory of, quote, US democracy, unquote. A definitive narrative requires an intensive collection of oral histories as planned by this project. But there has been another type of collaboration between Africans and African Americans. The African population in Harlem has increased significantly in the 21st century. The Senegalese and other Francophone populations have revived a severely blighted area of Harlem on 116th Street from Morningside Park to Fifth Avenue. It was dubbed Little Senegal and marked the prominence of the Senegalese population as the standard bearers for this new wave of migration. Despite their work in building community and in raising children in Harlem, they are now being pushed out of Harlem by the gentrification of their area. Additionally, the experiences that many have had reflect the deterioration of race relations and attitudes towards immigrants. Although like Nkrumah and Ezekwe, Black people have similar experiences, they are experiencing the new forms of brutality and persecution that fall on the domestic Black population. Two examples stand out in tragic detail. One was the police shooting of a young Guinean immigrant in the Bronx, Amadou Diallo, in the early hours of February 4th, 1999. 4 policemen looking for a serial rapist saw him outside his own door and assumed that he was reaching for a gun when he was trying to get his wallet. They fired 41 shots, fatally hitting him with 19. Although indicted, the 4 policemen were acquitted, sparking an uproar about police contact. His parents, Siaku and Khadijatu Diallo, were from a historic Fulbe trading family in Guinea. The city became familiar with a prominent African family with international connections. But in terms of the incident itself, Diallo became a typical African-American victim of police violence. Another incident involved a fire on March 7, 2007, that killed 11 members, 4 of which were children, of a Malian family living in a multi-storied house in the Bronx. The fire spread through the stairway, trapping the family while the father was out at work driving a livery taxi. The city grieved deeply and coverage was on the news for weeks. A reporter was sent to Mali to film the funeral. The neighbors, largely Latinos, embraced the remaining family members. ASA's annual meeting was in New York that year, and the Outreach Council gave an award to a book on Mali written by a Malian father and his daughter. We arranged for them to visit the Bronx School of the Child Victims, and they read the book to the grieving children in their class. The children could actually see the burned building from their classroom, and they deeply missed their classmates. Again, this was a tragedy caused by lax safety standards, so typical for areas inhabited by people of color. And finally, a lament. The historic Harlem that I have described is being rapidly destroyed. Soon it will not be possible to remember the history or to see the built structures or cultural places that are important reference points for the history of the 20th and 21st centuries. As noted above, the Senegalese who revitalized a blighted 116th Street to be Little Senegal are being relocated to the Bronx, and their street has fewer and fewer African restaurants. The Shabazz Market, a collection of African vendors on 116th Street, has never drawn the number of customers they had when they were located in the 125th Street Mart. My community is fighting the oversaturation of methadone clinics run by nonprofits. Harlem is caught in a vise. On the one hand are the developers building expensive condominiums. On the other, it is a dumping ground for clinics with only 20% Harlem clients. My neighborhood, Sugar Hill, stopped such a nonprofit from converting a $4 million historic limestone into a methadone clinic. The Black population, foreign and domestic, is disappearing. We can only try to preserve the history and to ensure that institutions like the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture preserves this history. Join us in this struggle. This project, which will involve several people from the period, will document this important period of Harlem history. As Cabral has noted, it is also a contribution for you to never forget that you are Africans. Thank you very much for listening.